welcome to KU Padasala. I am Sangili Krishna, Research Scholar at the Department of Psychology, University of Kerala. Today, I am dealing with the concept of cognition and the fields for investigating cognition. So, cognitive psychology is the psychological study of cognition. The origin of cognitive psychology occurred in the 1960s in the break from behaviorism. So, behaviorism focused on the observable and measurable behaviors until 1960s. Unobservable mental processes were outside the realm of empirical science then. So, with the emergence of cognitive psychology during 1960s, the mental processes which were not observable became a subject matter in the discipline of psychology. So, what is cognition? It is a word which has been borrowed from the classic language Latin, which means to know. It is a mental action or process of acquiring knowledge, understanding through thought, experience and senses. So, cognitive psychology is about how our knowledge is organized, how it is created by what we see, hear and sense. Typically, cognitive psychology study of topics like memory, perception, sensation, action, language, etc. For example, cognitive psychologists might study how we see things, how it is being remembered, how it is stored in our memory. It might be the case that something is remembered naturally or some not. And that's the question. So, it is to study the condition in which the memory works well and the condition where it doesn't work well. So, there are numerous other topics in cognitive psychology study ranging from how we catch a ball. For example, let it be an imaginary ball, or how children learn languages. So, for example, catching a ball can be a very normal activity, but actually it is not. It is a very complex process where we need to track the power of the ball and we have to predict when it reaches to us and when we have to catch it. So, this process which we see as very normal is not that normal. It needs a very complex cognitive processes. Now, let us move to the fields for investigating cognition. There are mainly 4 fields or approaches for investigating about cognition. The first one is experimental cognitive psychology, and the next one is cognitive neuropsychology, and the third one is computational cognitive science, and the last one is cognitive neuroscience. The table here represents these 4 approaches. All these 4 approaches shows the gradual development in understanding about cognition. So, the investigation on cognition starts with the laboratory studies on normal individuals, and then we move to the brain damaged patients, then to the computational models and using numerous brain imaging techniques. Now, let us look each of these approaches in detail. So, the first approach in investigating cognition is experimental cognitive psychology. So, for many decades, nearly all research in cognitive psychology involved carrying out experiments on healthy individuals under laboratory conditions. So, in this approach, also experiments were conducted in normal individuals. And these experiments were typically tightly controlled and was scientific in nature. As we already said, these researches are designed to reveal the processes involved in attention, perception, learning, memory and so on. As this was the first approach, experimental cognitive psychology was known as the engine room of progress in the field of cognitive psychology. And the findings of these experiments have played a major role in the development of subsequent testings of major theories in cognitive psychology. And other areas like social, developmental and clinical psychology have all become more cognitive in recent years with the influence of experimental cognitive psychology. And many of the experimental tasks used by researchers in these areas are initially developed in the research laboratories of experimental cognitive psychology. As we have discussed all these things about this approach, experimental cognitive psychology has certain limitations also. Now, let us see what are these limitations. The first limitation is that laboratory researchers may lack ecological validity. I think you are familiar with the term ecological validity. So, it is the extent to which the findings of laboratory findings or laboratory studies is applicable to a real life setting. That is, how people behave in a laboratory settings may differ significantly from their behavior in their daily life. So in the real world, people constantly behave so as to have an impact from the environment. So in contrast, in most of the research experiments, the sequence of stimuli the experimenter present to the participant is not influenced by their behavior, but rather it has been determined by the experimenter's predetermined plan. So this is the first limitation. So moving to the next limitation, experimental cognitive psychologists typically obtain measures of speed and accuracy of tasks they are performing. These measures provide only indirect evidence about the internal processes involved in human cognition and about their relationship to each other. This is the second limitation. And the next limitation is that most cognitive psychologists fail to take individual differences seriously. Much of the topics in cognitive psychology like decision making, reasoning, expertise, etc. deals with an individual's intelligence, thinking and behavior, but a cognitive psychologist would forget the links between this cognitive psychology and the area of intelligence of an individual, but focus more on its progress generally. Here the emphasis on individual difference is largely ignored. This is another limitation. So as the investigation on cognition progress, we may move to the next approach. This is cognitive neuropsychology. It is concerned with the cognitive performance of brain damaged patients. In the first approach, we were conducting experiments on healthy individuals. In this approach, we are conducting experiments or dealing with brain damaged patients. The major goal of this approach is to use information gained from brain damaged patients to understand normal human cognition. So this goal is based on the assumption that complex systems often reveal their inner working more clearly when they are malfunctioning than when they are running smoothly. So from these assumptions, the studies were being developed. For example, McCloskey in 2001, a cognitive neuropsychologist, described how he began to understand how his laser printer worked when it started misprinting things. Thus, we may develop an understanding of cognitive processes in intact individuals by focusing on a particular problems in cognition experienced by brain damaged patients. There are numerous fascinating conditions produced by brain damage. For example, one such condition is called face blindness or prosopagnosia. Patients with this condition suffer much embarrassment because they cannot recognize faces. As a result, they are in constant danger of greeting complete strangers as long lost friends or ignoring close friends. Those with face blindness have reasonably good object recognition for most objects other than faces. That suggests that there is a part of the brain which is specialized for face recognition. So Kohlherth in 2001 had identified the main theoretical assumptions of cognitive neuropsychology, and we are discussing two of these assumptions here. The first one is that cognitive psychology is based on modularity, which means that it consists of numerous independent processes or modules. For example, we have already explained face blindness or prosopagnosia by assuming that there is a module that responds to face stimuli, and this is the module damaged in patients with face blindness or prosopagnosia. So this is the first assumption, and the second assumption is that there is an assumption of subtractivity. So what is it? So it is the basic idea that the brain damage impairs one or more modules but cannot lead to the development of any new one. That is the assumption of subtractivity. As a result, the study of persons with damage to module X can provide useful information about the role of module X in normal human cognition. The one way in which cognitive neuropsychologists try to understand how the cognitive system works is by searching for dissociations. So a dissociation occurs when a participant performs at the same level as healthy individuals on one task but severely impaired on the second task. For example, if a person with amnesia performs well on tasks involved in short-term memory but very poor on tasks involved in long-term memory. So this suggests that short-term memory and long-term memory involve separate modules in human brain. Suppose we found other patients who had very poor performance on most short-term memory tasks but had a very intact long-term memory. We would then have a double dissociation. That is, in some patients performing at the same level as healthy individuals on task X but being impaired on task Y, with others showing the opposite pattern. This is what double dissociation means. This double dissociation provides a strong evidence that there are separate short-term memory and long-term memory systems or modules in human brain. So we have seen cognitive neuropsychological approach has contributed much to our understanding of normal human cognition, but it has certain limitations also. So the first limitation is that the organization of human brain is far less neat and tidy than is implied by cognitive neuropsychologists with their emphasis on modularity. That is, the brain is composed of about 50 billion interconnected neurons. A modular descriptions may seem to be apt for a complex cognitive function, but the same function relies on a number of interconnected brain regions or systems. So this interconnected nature of the brain is not addressed much in cognitive neuropsychology, so this is being considered as a limitation. So moving to the second limitation, cognitive neuropsychology generally seems more comfortable dealing with relatively specific aspects of cognitive functioning. Perhaps because more general aspects do not lead to themselves readily to modular account. For example, consider the study of language. Much of the research has been on the reading and spelling of individual words by brain damaged patients, but little emphasis is given in broader issues concerned with comprehension of text or speech. This is a second limitation. So moving to the third limitation is that in order to make a rapid progress, it would be ideal to find patients in whom brain damage has affected only a single module or as one module. In fact, brain damage is typically much more extensive than that. When several different processing modules or processes are damaged, it is generally very difficult to interpret the findings based on the concept of modularity. This is the third limitation of the approach. So these are the three limitations of this approach, and we have two other approaches also. So this remaining approaches will be discussed by Dr. Tissy Mariam Thomas.
Thank you, Sangili. Among the fields for investigating cognition, we have studied about experimental cognitive psychology and cognitive neuropsychology. Moving on to the next two approaches, which are computational cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience. Computational cognitive science is another way of studying cognition by constructing artificial systems doing some of the same things as our own brain. Is computational modeling and artificial intelligence the same? Computational modeling involves programming computers to model or mimic some aspects of cognitive functioning. In contrast, artificial intelligence involves constructing computer systems that produce intelligent outcomes. But the processes involved here typically bear little resemblance to those used by humans. For example, a chess program known as Deep Blue managed to beat the then world chess champion Garry Kasparov. It did so by considering huge numbers of moves every second, and thus its approach was radically different from that adopted by human chess players. Computational cognitive scientists who want to develop a computational model start by identifying precisely the processes used by humans when performing some task or tasks. This may involve relying on one or more previous theories that have been developed to understand performance on that task. But there are problems in taking an existing theory and implementing it as a program. Theories that are only expressed verbally often contain hidden assumptions or vague terms. This is much less likely to happen with a computer program because all the details need to be spelled out. For example, Atkinson and Shiffrin model of memory, which all of us are familiar about, in which it was assumed that rehearsal leads to the long-term storage of the information being rehearsed. The more times a word is rehearsed, the better it is remembered over time. This model was used to account for findings from studies in which a list of words was presented, followed by the participants writing down as many words as possible in any order. So if we wanted to make precise predictions, we would need to know the following at least. 1. How long does it take to rehearse one word? 2. How many words are rehearsed together? 3. How rapidly does information about a rehearsed word accumulate in long-term memory? Atkinson and Shiffrin did not provide answers to most of these questions, but this would need to be answered to produce an adequate computer model. There are certain strengths and limitations of this approach. Some of the main strengths of this approach is computational model of psychological theories provides a strong test of their adequacy. The reason is that computational models have to be explicit about every theoretical assumptions, unlike traditional theories expressed in verbal terms. And another advantage is that it supports the development of more complex theories in cognitive psychology. That is, in many cognitive theories, theorists can rapidly reach a point where the theory's complexity makes it very difficult to say what the theory might predict. In contrast, the predictions from a computational model can be generated rapidly and easily by simply running the model with the appropriate stimuli. Not only advantages, there are certain limitations also in this approach. The main limitations are, the first one, computational models are relatively rarely used to make new predictions. Computational cognitive scientists typically develop a model of performance on some task that accounts for existing human data but does not go beyond that. It would be more impressive if new predictions were made and confirmed. And the next limitation is that most computational models are limited in scope. Human cognition is typically influenced by several potentially conflicting motivational and emotional forces, as we know, which may be operative at the same time. Very few computational models even try to capture these wider aspects of cognition. The motivational and emotional forces, which are part of all the cognitive forces, all the cognitive process, are failed to be included in a computational model. So moving to our final approach on our investigation on cognition, that is cognitive neuroscience. This approach involves using numerous brain imaging techniques to study aspects of brain functioning and structure relevant to human cognition. As the technology grows, we now have numerous new and exciting ways of obtaining detailed information about the brain functioning and structure. We can work out where and when in the brain specific cognitive processes occur. Such information allows us to determine the order in which different parts of the brain become active when someone is performing a task. It also allows us to find out whether two tasks involve the same parts of the brain in the same way, on whether there are important differences. Some of the most important techniques for studying brain activities are fundamental magnetic resonance imaging (fMRI), transcranial magnetic stimulation (TMS), magnetoencephalography (MEG), positron emission tomography (PET), single unit recording and event related potential, that is ERPs. Let us look at each technique more clearly. fMRI is a technique that involves the detection of magnetic changes in the brain. Transcranial magnetic stimulation is a technique in which a coil or a pair of coils is placed close to the participant's head and a large, very brief pulse of current will run through it. This produces a short-lived magnetic field inhibiting processing in the brain area affected. Magnetoencephalography. This technique measures the magnetic fields produced by electrical brain activity. It provides fairly detailed information at the millisecond level about the time course of cognitive processes, and its spatial resolution is reasonably good. The next technique, that is PET, positron emission tomography. This involves a detection of positrons, which are the atomic particles emitted from some radioactive substances. Next one, that is single unit recording, involves inserting a micro electrode 1/10,000th of a millimeter in diameter into the brain to study activity in single neurons. The last technique, event related potentials, ERPs. The same stimulus is presented repeatedly and the pattern of electrical brain activity recorded by several scalp electrodes is averaged to produce a single waveform. This technique allows us to work out the timing of various cognitive processes. Do brain imaging techniques provide the answers to all our prayers? There are certain limitations for doubting it. First one is, most brain imaging techniques indicate only that there are associations between patterns of brain activation and behavior. For example, performance on a reasoning task is associated with activation of the prefrontal cortex, front part of the brain. Such associations are essentially correlational and of limited value, but the correlations do not show that an area is necessary for a particular function. And the next limitation is that numerous brain imaging studies have lacked any clear theoretical basis. So, we have come to the end of today's class. We studied about 4 various approaches of the field for investigating cognitive psychology. We also studied about the strengths and limitations of these approaches. This knowledge would help an aspiring cognitive psychology student to research mental processes more effectively. Thank you.